Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 12th of April. And where we are is moving from the history plays to the tragedies. Though we were talking about Richard II and its title in its entirety, the tragedy of Richard II has many elements that we would expect with tragedies, but the distinction is that Richard II is a British play and based on British history. And that's what distinguishes the history plays as opposed to the tragedies. And you should have submitted in your first paper by this point, and I should have returned it to you by this point. So if that hasn't happened, please contact me. As you know, the second paper will be due at the ending of the semester on the latter half of the plays that we discussed over the semester. You have the opportunity to rewrite the first paper for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in your original copy with my comments along with your revision. You have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And the idea is that the first paper was your learning exercise so that there wouldn't necessarily need to be a revision for the second paper because it would be due at the very ending of the semester. Though I had indicated that occasionally students have been able to submit in that second paper early enough so that we could negotiate the possibility of a revision, but that's something that you would have to do with me individually. Everybody has the option of doing a revision for the first paper. And I am in the midst of grading your journal for Richard II, so I should get that back to you. And we were talking a little bit about tragedies and the tragic tradition, and that goes all the way back to BC Greek drama with Sophocles' Oedipus the King, which is usually identified as one of the greatest and finest tragedies ever written, at least according to Aristotle, who, in addition to philosophy, dabbled in a little bit of literary criticism. And the tragedy also helped to establish the tragic hero, which I was talking about in the context of Richard, and that a tragic hero would be a great individual above and beyond the ordinary, who would experience some sort of a downfall, in part because of outside forces beyond their control, but in part also because of flaws within character. And then that individual would accept some level of responsibility for their fall, and there would be learning that would go on both for the character and also for us as audience members. And that for Oedipus the King, this worked very well because what we get is a man who basically was given a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. He does everything within his ability to avoid having that prophecy come true. And the irony in the play is that all of the actions he takes to avoid the prophecy from coming true actually bring him closer to the prophecy. The twist is that he doesn't realize that he is adopted and that the person that he will ultimately kill will be his biological father, and the person he will ultimately marry will be his biological mother. And while certainly there are a good number of flaws within his character that help bring about his downfall, such as arrogance and short temper and denial, there also is that outside force of prophecy or the outside force of destiny. And that's something that can't be changed by an individual. Now, Shakespeare would have been well aware of this definition and would have used it and also changed it to suit his purposes. So we were talking about that in the context of Richard, that perhaps Richard could be considered a great man because of his royal birthright, that he would have been seen as second to God, basically, in the chain of being. Does Richard experience a downfall? I think, oh yes, he does, because he loses his kingdom, and eventually he loses his life. And we could perhaps say that Richard's outside forces might be something like Bolingbroke, particularly if Bolingbroke is actively trying to remove Richard from power and is doing it in a very sly political way. That said, the outside forces are a bit trickier in terms of Richard. Definitely, we see flaws within Richard's character. Many of you indicated in your attendance questions, some of your favorite quotes happen to be the quotes in where he engaged in self-pity and self-centeredness rather than thinking about the importance of his rule. And then ultimately, whether or not Richard accepts responsibility, we could say when he's alone finally in prison that he begins to understand some of the errors of his ways, as he recites my favorite line, I've wasted time and now time doth waste me. Or we could say that he's just being self-centered and ultimately engages in action a little bit too little, a little bit too late when he tries to defend his life. So the idea of tragic hero is complicated in the tragedy of Richard II. And again, Richard II not technically being a tragedy, it being a history play. Now, we talked a little bit about Richard and why that was such an important play in terms of what was happening politically in England. That Queen Elizabeth was nearing the ending of her reign because she was getting elderly, and she never married. There were no direct heirs in place, so there was a lot of concern about who would take over the kingdom. But politics being a very dangerous subject to discuss, that would be something that wouldn't openly be discussed in public. But certainly, a play like Richard, which asks its viewers to consider questions such as who has the ability to rule and who has the right to rule. Is it based on blood right, regardless of actions, such as Richard? Or perhaps it's based on temperament and ability, such as Bolingbroke? Or perhaps it's some combination of the two. That play would work very nicely to address some of the political questions that were going on in Renaissance society. While Shakespeare could also protect himself by saying that he wasn't directly addressing some of the turmoil that could occur when Elizabeth died, and that he was just basically reviewing a past historical episode of England. When we get to Shakespeare's tragedy, specifically Macbeth, this play was written for the new monarch, and this would be King James. This is a Scottish king, and this is known as the Scottish play. And this is also Shakespeare's shortest play, and I did that deliberately because at this point in the semester, I know that time is of the essence, and I didn't necessarily want to give us a play that as the length of Hamlet, one of Shakespeare's longest plays that almost always is abridged when it's performed just because of its sheer length. But I think also Macbeth is a wonderful play in relation to our examining questions of tragedy and tragic hero. And it also is one of my favorite plays just because of the darkness and the Gothic nature associated with it. As many of you know, I'm a fan of the Gothic. Macbeth comes with some folklore associated with it. It's known as a cursed play. There have been some episodes that would seem to indicate that bad luck is associated with this play. Actors will not say the name Macbeth. They call it the end play or that play because it's considered bad luck to be able to say the particular name. And the play was written in part to try to appeal to King James. King James liked shorter plays. And here we go with Macbeth, one of actually Shakespeare's shortest play. King James was very interested in the supernatural. And here we go with Shakespeare giving us a play that addresses the supernatural. Macbeth being so famous for its three witches. And of course, Macbeth is the Scottish play, and King James had lineage in Scotland. So Shakespeare being the consummate businessman, understanding that while he had support of Queen Elizabeth, he would have to try to drive up the same sort of support with the new monarch so that he could continue to put on plays. Because as we discussed at the time of the Renaissance, play acting and even play viewing was considered to be somewhat of a lowbrow activity. But fortunately for us, the Queen loved the arts, including theater, which is one of the reasons why the plays still remain for us to watch and to read. So, in addition to the dark atmosphere of Macbeth, it also is very interesting in terms of its portrayal of women. And we had talked about this with A Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing, about some strong female characters that might have seemed somewhat surprising considering the stereotypes and expectations of the Renaissance, as well as also some weaker females. And then when we get to Richard, we talked about how it was a very male-centric play, and that was probably very deliberate to show how what happens in a male-centric world where female happens to be excluded. Though, of course, we do have small flashes here. Of course, something like Aumerle's mother demanding that he be forgiven by Bolingbroke can show a certain level of strength. But basically, Richard is a male play. When we get to Macbeth, I've oftentimes joked that perhaps this play should be called Lady Macbeth because of the incredible force of her character and also the witches themselves. So we've got strong females. Granted, they're evil, but we've got strong females. So that's something to consider as well. And while we've been talking about performance, and I've been trying to show you various kinds of performance, whether it be something from, let's say, Shakespeare's Globe Theater, which is how we began with the Midsummer Night's Dream, or whether it be something like a Hollywood version, or the contemporary actor Kenneth Branagh, known for many of his Shakespearean adaptations, or whether it be the BBC, and that's what we talked about with Richard II and their project to try to duplicate as closely as possible Shakespeare's language and intent. There also is a company that you may have heard of called the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was established in the 1960s in London, Stratford-upon-Avon. This was Shakespeare's birthplace, again with the goal and mission to be able to put on Shakespeare's plays in a somewhat authentic manner, but also adapting it for modern sensibilities. And I was able to find on YouTube a production for Macbeth from the Royal Shakespeare Company that is available for free. So I thought what we could do is watch the first part of that production today. That would be up until minute 58.15, right before we get a transition. And then we could finish watching it next class, and then we could talk about the actual play itself and what's going on within the play. For today's class attendance question, which would be due on Tuesday, the 13th at 8 a.m., my question to you is about the first part of the play, because at the very, very beginning, we're introduced to the witches, and it's based on the witches and their prophecy that ultimately Macbeth takes the following actions. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but as a tragedy, you can bet that things aren't going to work out well. So my question is, do you think the witches could be considered an outside force in the way we've been talking about outside forces with tragedy and tragic hero? An outside force influencing Macbeth's subsequent actions, and why or why not? And we'll see the witches a little bit later on in the play as well, but certainly the highlight of the witches is at the very beginning of the play, where they present Macbeth with his prophecies. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And enjoy Macbeth. Take care. Bye-bye.